The New Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. The Case of the Fools of Bethlehem. By Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Nora Godwin. Narrated by Peter Silverleaf. At the end of August 1886, I stayed in Eastbourne for a few days to attend a congress for forensic pathology. Holmes had insisted that we, me, improved our competencies in this area. He himself, of course, had strongly rejected to participate locally, and so we remained separated for an extended weekend. I must confess that this was also relaxing, in a way. However, when I returned to Baker Street the following Tuesday, I was confronted with a situation that was not only highly surprising, but also deeply disturbing. Mrs. Hudson received me at the front door and immediately confirmed the desperate impression she had already made visually. "Finally, you're back, Dr. Watson," she began bluntly. "Something terrible has happened." The good woman had tears in her eyes and then buried her face in her hands. I didn't really know what to think of it, but I was immediately troubled. A queasy feeling crept into me, but I kept my countenance on the outside. "Calm down, Mrs. Hudson," I said, not knowing what this was all about. "I'm sure Mr. Holmes and I will be able to solve the problem." But Mrs. Hudson shook her head. "I'm afraid that won't be possible," she sobbed. "It's about Mr. Holmes." "Holmes?" I asked, irritated. "What about him? Is he all right?" I wanted to rush past Mrs. Hudson to the first floor to see Holmes, but our housekeeper held me back. "He's not here," she stammered. "They picked him up." "For heaven's sake," I cried. "What's the matter? Is he injured? Don't tell me he's dead." Mrs. Hudson immediately waved off to my relief. No, she said, "but the police took him and locked him up." I took a deep breath. I had always been aware that one day it would come this far. Yes, so far that Holmes would stretch the boundaries a little too much and end up in jail. "Well, after all, Holmes is physically unharmed," I said, to reassure myself. "But what is he accused of? Why was Holmes arrested?" "I don't know," Mrs. Hudson replied, still weeping. "The police officers were extremely rude and refused to give any information to me. When they led Mr. Holmes away in handcuffs this morning, they just said it was a very serious matter and he would spend a long time behind bars." Giving this some thought, I accompanied Mrs. Hudson to her premises and prepared her a cup of tea to calm down. When the poor woman had gathered herself again, I left her alone. I had to get to the bottom of it. "Don't worry, Mrs. Hudson," I said as a farewell. "I am now going to Scotland Yard to resolve this matter. There is no doubt that this must be a misunderstanding. Holmes will be a free man again in no time." Without being convinced by this assessment myself, I then made my way to the police headquarters at Whitehall Place. There was a deep uncertainty about what was to come, because I had serious doubts as to whether things could actually be sorted out. But when I stood in front of Inspector Lestrade, I was briefly drawn to the foolish hope that a bad joke or secret plan would now be revealed to me. But this was not the case. "I am sincerely sorry, Dr. Watson," Inspector Lestrade explained, "but my hands are tied. Holmes was duly arrested because of the embezzlement of evidence. In addition, in the course of the official act, he was guilty of physical resistance to the power of the state." Admittedly, the former accusation always hovered over Holmes's activities like a sword of Damocles, although I couldn't explain how Scotland Yard should have got tangible information, even evidence, on this matter. Holmes was clearly superior to them. As far as the second point is concerned, however, I had to follow up. "What do you mean by physical resistance?" I asked. "Holmes did not really attack a police officer, did he?" "He certainly did," Inspector Lestrade replied. He didn't want to be arrested. He got into a rage and rampaged like a wild animal." "Like a wild animal?" I repeated incredulously, knowing that such a thing was not like Holmes' normal self. "That's nonsense. Holmes would never lose control of himself and his actions. Did he beat one of the officials?" Inspector Lestrade hesitated and finally declared, "Well, not exactly beaten. No, that's not. Rather, well, yes." "For heaven's sake, Inspector," I cried impatiently, "stop stammering and finally tell me what Holmes did." "Of course, Dr. Watson," Lestrade said after another pause of thought. "Then I will get right to the point. He bit him." For a moment, words completely failed me. Then I asked, "Excuse me, but who bit whom?" "Well, Mr. Holmes bit one of the police officers," Inspector Lestrade replied without hesitation. I had to laugh out loud, because at this point I was absolutely certain that they wanted to make a fool out of me. "Excellent joke, Inspector," I shouted. "Congratulations, you have deceived me after all. Was that Holmes's idea? Holmes, come out. The comedy is over." But Holmes did not walk through a door and did not step in front of a curtain, and Inspector Lestrade's unchanged serious face also told me that he was serious. "Is this true?" I asked tentatively. Inspector Lestrade nodded. "Much to my dismay, yes," he confirmed. 3 times. Holmes bit the officer 3 times. On the arm and hand, and at the end on the nose. The wound on the hand even had to be sewn." Such behaviour by Holmes was, of course, bizarre. He must have gone mad, or he acted under the influence of a drug overdose. Anyway, he would only be able to clarify the matter himself. "I have to see him right away," I demanded. "What kind of prison did you put Holmes in?" "No prison," Inspector Lestrade replied with a sigh. "Because of his irrational and unnecessarily aggressive behaviour, Holmes was taken to an institution for mentally abnormal individuals." "Into a madhouse?" I cried heatedly. "You put Holmes in a madhouse?" "To a psychiatric hospital, a sanatorium," Inspector Lestrade corrected. "And I would like to add that this decision was not in my jurisdiction." "I understand," I replied briefly. "Who is responsible for this?" Inspector Lestrade hesitated for a moment again, and then said, "The instruction came from the very top. I can't say more." I started to seethe on the inside, but I limited myself to the question, "Where is he?" "At the Bethlem Royal Hospital," Inspector Lestrade replied. I left the Inspector and Scotland Yard without a word, because it would probably have been an ugly one. I immediately went to Southwark, where the so-called clinic was located in Lambeth Road. The facility had been around since the 14th century. The inmates mentally ill and those who were declared mentally ill for other reasons vegetated there for a long time in devastating conditions. There could be no question of treatment in the medical and psychiatric sense, or even healing. This institution was much rather used for locking away unpredictable individuals. Those who were classified as fools by society, by the church, or by politics disappeared for a long time, or even forever, behind the walls of Bedlam, as the sanatorium is commonly called. But there is no doubt that neurology and psychiatry have made considerable progress in recent years. Even though these changes would reflect in the relevant clinics, the usual attempts to cure continue to be either with experimental drugs or, in the worst case, surgical. At least the living circumstances were slowly approaching the therapeutic, hygienic, caring and human professional standards of other hospitals. Nevertheless, I had always maintained a certain distrust towards the Bethlem Royal Hospital. That was the reason why I was, to a further extent, very concerned about the fact that Holmes was currently a patient there. I entered the building, which in fact resembled a prison, through the main entrance and entered the only freely accessible area. In the foyer, a middle-aged lady with pitch-black hair and a dark gaze sat behind a counter. It was unusually large and powerfully built. In addition to this reception area, an iron door with large locks led into the actual interiors of the clinic. "Good morning," I addressed the lady. "My name is Dr. John Watson. I was told that my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes was staying here. Would it be possible to speak to him?" The receptionist didn't even look up and shook her head. "You came here for nothing. The chief physician does not allow visits." I was surprised, but of course I was not going to be fobbed off by that answer. "Maybe I'm wrong," I explained, "and this is not a hospital, it's a dungeon. Otherwise I wouldn't know what would speak against visiting patients, or should we rather call them inmates?" The lady was obviously annoyed at my tenacity, exhaled aloud and looked at me with raised eyebrows. "Dear highly esteemed sir," she said, "the treatment of mental illness is a highly complex matter. For this reason, the chief physician does not tolerate any improper disorder." I tried to remain friendly and explained in a gentle tone, "Maybe you misunderstood me. I'm a doctor of medicine myself and Mr. Holmes' family doctor. You won't want to deny me access to my patient?" The answer was short. "He is no longer your patient, but ours." Now I stood there somewhat perplexed and briefly thought about what Holmes would do. Apparently it was time for a little cunning. "Madam," I began anew, "I didn't travel 1,000 miles to stay idle. I have taken a leave of absence from my position at the Imperial Royal Psychiatric University Hospital in Vienna, and I am reasonably convinced that your senior doctor does not want to give up a visit from the leading institution in Europe. Maybe you want to report my arrival to the esteemed head of your institute." The lady looked up again from her documents and looked briefly in my eyes. Then she took a keychain from the shelf behind her and disappeared wordlessly through the heavy iron door to the left of the counter. I stayed alone in the foyer and looked around, but there was nothing to see. The stone walls were unadorned, the room empty. Only the receptionist's workplace was sparsely furnished. There were no windows. After a few minutes, which seemed like hours, the lady returned, accompanied by a bald-headed older gentleman in a white doctor's coat, who quickly brushed his round glasses as he entered. Then he went straight to me. "Dr. Watson from Vienna, as I hear," he said, reaching out to me. "I am Dr. Seward, the chief physician of Bethlem." "Very pleased," I replied, trying for a confident handshake. "My assistant, Miss Renfield," Dr. Seward continued, "suggested that you are interested in one of our cases. Is that true?" I nodded. "Quite right," I confirmed. "It's Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Dr. Seward smiled confidently. "Mr. Holmes," he repeated. "Oh, yes, an interesting patient. Well, it is, of course, an honor for us to welcome a colleague from the renowned Vienna University Hospital, and I will be happy to show you our patient. May I ask you why you are particularly interested in Mr. Holmes?" "He is a former acquaintance and a former patient," I said. "In this respect, I would like to assess the current state of affairs in order to draw professional conclusions about the course of the disease. I am hoping to get from the specific to the general and to completely new, groundbreaking insights." "Fascinating," Seward said. "You will have to explain this to me in more detail in an expert discussion. It would undoubtedly be very valuable for us to benefit from the world-famous advances in Viennese psychiatric medicine." "Certainly," I said, "all in good time. First of all, though, I would like to see the patient." The chief medical officer nodded, went ahead and opened the iron door with his keychain. I followed him and entered the inside of the clinic. Behind us, the heavy door closed with a shuddering thud. Behind the door were dark corridors that led circularly through the building. On the outer circle, the patients were housed, behind locked security doors like in a prison. On the inner circle were treatment rooms and depots. Every now and then you could hear blood-curdling screams and sometimes a penetrating laugh. Dr. Seward didn't seem to be bothered by any of that. "You have to know, Dr. Watson," he told frankly, "that our working conditions lag behind those in Vienna or Paris. This is mostly due to lack of funding. I am the only inpatient doctor for 50 inmates. Miss Renfeld, my only help, she is also a trained nurse. Other doctors or surgeons are only called in on a case-by-case basis. Hence the strict security precautions. We can't, of course, observe everyone and everything at all times." "That's unfortunate," I replied. "In my opinion, the Empire would be well advised to provide as much treatment as possible in its psychiatric hospitals. After all, a significant proportion of patients are former soldiers with traumatic experiences." "Generally speaking, you are right," Dr. Seward replied, "but that's not the case with us. We only treat civilians. Our patients are more or less officially admitted here at the request of relatives on medical advice, on police or judicial instructions." "That means," I asked, "no one is here voluntarily?" Dr. Seward smiled sheepishly. "Well, I wouldn't put it that way," he said. "Of course, the mentally ill person usually lacks an understanding of the need for treatment." "I understand," I replied with a serious expression. "Another reason for heavily fortified doors and security locks?" The senior doctor shrugged his shoulders. "It's only for the best," he said. Then he stopped at a door. "Here it is. Number 221. He opened a slit and looked through it. "This is Mr. Holmes's room," he said. "We can enter." He opened the door and walked in first. I followed him and found myself in a small room that, as expected, resembles more of a dungeon cell than a hospital. At the back wall there was a bed, adjoining on the head end with the wall. There was no other furniture or other objects, or a window. I quickly took a step towards the bed and found Holmes sleeping peacefully, but in a deplorable state. More pale than usual, with collapsed cheek and an unshaven face. His dark, circled eyes were tightly closed, the hair tangled, and a little saliva fluid ran out of the slightly opened mouth. The face and body remained motionless, but the wrists and ankles were tied to the bed frame with leather straps as a precaution. He had suffered a ruptured bruise on his chin and a hematoma on his left cheekbone, presumably the result of the violent arrest. I noticed a flat breathing and a regular but slowed heartbeat. Apparently Holmes had been calmed down with medication. I pointed to the shackles and looked at Dr. Seward. "Is this really necessary?" "Unfortunately," replied the chief medical officer, "for his own and for our safety. The patient shows a willingness to use violence towards himself, but even more so towards the medical and nursing staff. Even when fixed, he snaps around like a rabid dog." "He was therefore sedated with pharmaceuticals, I suppose?" I asked. Dr. Seward nodded. "We had to get the full arsenal up," he said. "Until now the patient could hardly be tamed. Of course, a reasonable basis for discussion could not yet be established." I frowned and reproachfully said, "Well, if you continue to turn the patient's brain into a vegetable, it will stay that way." The chief physician took a deep breath. "My dear colleague," he began, "as I said, we do not have the same resources and staff here as you are used to from your Viennese clinic, but I am open to your suggestions." I thought for a moment and looked at Holmes. "Excuse me, Dr. Seward," I apologized. "I didn't want to offend you. I am sure you are doing everything in your power. Generally, however, it will be essential to communicate with the patient. Otherwise, promising therapy is virtually impossible. When will Mr. Holmes be responsive again?" "I'm afraid," Dr. Seward said, while he scratched his bald head, "you'll have to be patient for that. The patient won't be conscious for the next 24 hours. Even if he awakens, his state of mind will hardly allow a reasonable exchange of words." That was certainly not what I wanted to hear. After all, it was my ambition to get Holmes out of there as soon as possible. "I understand," I said, To what extent can you even say what exactly is wrong with the patient?" "Well, Dr. Watson," explained the chief physician, "we would all like to see that psychiatry already was as accurate as various areas of classical medicine. But as you know, in many respects we are still at the beginning of gaining knowledge. As far as I can tell, he has a manic disorder. Delirium sine febre cum furore et audacia is my preliminary diagnosis. You will probably agree with that assessment, won't you?" It was not easy for me to conceal my inner anger, because this charlatan had just diagnosed Holmes with nothing but madness and craziness. It is a miracle that his therapy proposals did not include bloodletting and exorcism. But I remained calm and replied, "Right, Dr. Seward. Superficially, this seems beyond doubt. Nevertheless, we can only determine the right kind of treatment if we find the cause of his mentally ill state." Before Dr. Seward was able to answer, a hard knock at the door, and Miss Renfield's voice interrupted. "Dr. Seward, come quickly. It's about Miss Murray." The chief medical officer hesitated only briefly. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, quickly leaving the room. I was left alone with the unconscious and shackled Holmes. I stepped to the bed and grabbed my friend's hand. "My dear Holmes," I muttered, "what just happened to you?" For a few seconds I closed my eyes and at least gave myself to my despair. But all of a sudden someone called my name. "Watson!" I looked around, startled before realizing that the voice belonged to Holmes. He woke up. His red eyes wide open, he clutched my hand with a firm grip. "Watson!" he repeated excitedly. "You have to help me." "Don't worry, old friend," I assured. "I'll get you out of here." But Holmes slammed his head back and forth. "No, no," he shouted. "You have to find it. Right away. Find." "Calm down, Holmes," I said in a soft voice. "What should I find?" Holmes put on a bewildered look. "Can't you hear it?" he asked. I also countered with an astonished expression. "What shall I hear?" "The green light," replied Holmes. The drugs must have afflicted Holmes to a degree. Apparently he was a little disorientated. "Fine, I'll take care of it," I promised. "But you must also help me. Tell me what happened. Why in God's name did you bite the policeman?" Holmes maintained his incomprehensible state. "The book was always too cold," he cried. "I had to sew all the horse hooves together. Rapido, rapido, even before the locomotive goes to the altar at 31 o'clock, at all costs, stripped, not shaken, but in all the crusts of the earth." I tried in vain to discover a sense in or behind Holmes's words, but there was none. He had lost his senses. "Calm down, Holmes," I said, putting my hand on his forehead. But Holmes shook his head vigorously. "No," he loudly ordered. "Don't open. The towers have to dance." Then he stared at me. "You are one of them. You are stuck under a blanket with those. Judas, go away. Help! Help!" He grabbed my hand to bite it, but I pulled back in time. Now it was certain, and it didn't help to deny it. Holmes had completely lost his mind. He was crazy. The next moment Dr. Seward returned. "What's going on here?" he asked. "I heard screams." I cleared my throat as Holmes pulled at the leather straps, growling like a ravenous street dog. "Well, the patient suddenly woke up," I said. "He started screaming first, then he became aggressive. Unfortunately, I was unable to reassure him. See for yourself." Dr. Seward nodded. "He should have slept through the night," he said. "Apparently we need to increase the dose. I'll instruct Miss Renfield on that." Then he took my arm and pulled me out of the cell. I was so stunned by the whole situation that I didn't resist. Behind us, Dr. Seward locked the door, Holmes' confused screams still audible. At the aisle, the senior doctor directed me towards the main gate and accompanied me. "Well, Doctor," he began, "what do you think about this case, now that you have experienced the full extent of mania and paranoia at first hand?" Of course, Holmes's condition affected me, but I tried to keep a straight face. I had to take control of the situation. "A very interesting case," I replied, "which I would like to continue to study. Do you think it would be possible to relocate the patient under my supervision? To a place where I could observe and examine him continuously and study him systematically? Care at home would be conceivable, of course, including all security measures and under my personal responsibility. I can relate to your interest, Dr. Seward replied, and you are welcome to visit us again, but a transfer will not be possible. The patient has been admitted here and is expected to remain until full recovery. An arrangement from the very top. The very top? I repeated suspiciously. Seward nodded. I can't say any more. And if there is no recovery? I asked, even though I already knew the answer. I am afraid, the chief medical officer confirmed, in this case, Mr. Holmes would have to remain in this institution for the rest of his life. When I left the so-called psychiatric hospital, everything seemed lost. There was no doubt about Holmes's complete mental derangement, nor that he would definitely pose a threat to his surroundings. He was rightly taken into custody. It seemed that the last case of England's greatest detective was his own case of illness, and this could not be solved. The only thing I could do for Holmes was to try to bring him home. Perhaps the familiar environment with careful care by Mrs. Hudson and my humble self would provide a chance of healing, however small it was. There was this reference made by Dr. Seward and Inspector Lestrade about an above instruction. I did not know who or what was interested in admitting Holmes to the Royal Hospital of Bethlehem and keeping him there. Perhaps there were forces at work here that acted far beyond my sphere of influence. So there was only one man in the world who could help me now. Holmes's brother Mycroft. I decided to go to him immediately. As expected, I met Mycroft Holmes at this time of day at the Diogenes Club, a society that Sherlock Holmes always disliked and which also did not correspond to my idea of conviviality. Too detached, nomen est omen, and the basic attitude was too cynical. When Mycroft saw me, he greeted me with the words, "You're finally here, Dr. Watson." For a brief moment I was irritated. "You were expecting me?" I asked. "Certainly," Mycroft replied, smiling, raising his whisky glass and taking a sip. "May I offer you something to drink?" I shook my head. "Thank you," I said, "but I'm here on an important issue. It's about your brother." Mycroft frowned. "He's not going to break out," he suspected. Once again I was surprised and stuttered only, "No, not at all, but—" "Then everything is fine," Mycroft interrupted me. "So you know that your brother was admitted to the Bethlehem Clinic?" I said. "Whether I know about it," Mycroft repeated with an almost arrogant grin. "I arranged it myself." For the third time I was not only amazed but also disappointed. "You?" I asked, somewhat upset. "You are responsible for this? You are taking your own brother to a madhouse? Why, for heaven's sake?" "I had no choice," Mycroft said calmly. "You saw poor Sherlock for yourself." "How do you know that?" I stammered. Mycroft ignored my question. "By the way, Dr. Watson," he continued, instead, "I congratulate you on your career advancement. I was not aware that you now have a position at the Imperial Royal Psychiatry in Vienna. What a great opportunity to refresh your knowledge of German. When are you going to leave for Austria?" "If you are so well informed," I replied, somewhat irritated, "you should also be aware that it was a small emergency lie. It is probably the wrong time to make jokes about this. Listen, your brother is dying in this institution. It is filled with tons of mentally active drugs. There is a serious risk that his brain will suffer serious damage that will be unrepairable." Mycroft drank from his whisky without showing any emotion, then said, "Just stay calm, Dr. Watson. The damage to Sherlock's brain is probably already done. He is in the best hands. I can assure you that Sherlock himself would support his continued accommodation in Bethlehem." I got into a rage. "How can you say something like this?" I cried in anger. You are completely insensitive to your brother. You are sending him to his ruin. I didn't realize you had such a nasty character." But Mycroft kept his composure. "Please, Dr. Watson, stay reasonable," he said. "Do you want a drink?" "You'd probably only give me a poisoned cup," I mocked loudly. "Just like your diabolical nature. You're about to kill your brother. You are a murderer." The next second I gave Mycroft a right hook on the chin, and he fell to the ground. Immediately 2 members of the club were there, grabbing me by the arms and holding me down. Meanwhile, another guest helped Mycroft back to his feet. Without paying any further attention, he instructed the staff. "Dr. Watson wants to leave us now. Be so kind and show him the exit." Then he turned around and headed towards the bar. "Mycroft," I shouted, "you're a nasty rat. Shame on you." But Sherlock Holmes's brother was already ignoring me. Under my loud protest and the laughter of the guests, I was carried out of the Diogenes Club uncomfortably. Again, as I was traversing the streets without any prospect of support, I knew it was up to me to help Holmes to be released from this institution. Without a concrete plan, I set off for Southwark. The least I could do was to try to have a conversation with Dr. Seward again. However, I imagined that if reason did not succeed, I might have to resort to violent means. I always had my pistol with me. When I was back in Lambeth Street, it was already dark. Determined, I entered the gloomy foyer where Miss Renfield stood upright behind the counter. "Good evening," I said, as I walked from the door to the front desk. Miss Renfield looked up from her papers and gave me a disrespectful look. "Oh, Dr. Watson," she said, "back from Vienna?" I ignored the remark, but I couldn't think of a suitable reply. "I want to talk to Dr. Seward right away," I demanded. "Sorry," Miss Renfield replied. "Dr. Seward is currently busy and unavailable. You will have to come back later." "It may be too late," I replied. "I kindly ask you to inform Dr. Seward immediately of the urgency of my request." Miss Renfield shook her head. "Sorry, Dr. Watson," she explained, "but Dr. Seward does not tolerate any disorder while he is undergoing surgery." "With an operation?" I asked. "What surgery?" "It's an experimental neurosurgical procedure on the brain," Miss Renfield said, "in patients who cannot be reassured by medication. The connecting nerve pathways between front lobe and thalamus are cut. Dr. Seward calls it leucotomy." I was not an expert in this field, but I knew that this would result in significant and irretrievable damage to the grey and white brain matter. The patient would become a soulless and mindless wreck, unable to express feelings, desires, or even the simplest thoughts. "That's barbaric," I protested. "What poor soul does Seward put under his butcher's knife?" Miss Renfield did not mince her words. "The patient to be operated on is Mr. Holmes," she said, without batting an eye. "Mr. Holmes?" I shouted. "Have you lost your mind? You must stop the operation immediately." "It's too late for that," Miss Renfield said. "Mr. Holmes is in the operating room and has already been anesthetized." Thunderstruck for a few seconds, I was paralyzed, unable to think and act. But then pure panic took over. "We have to stop Dr. Seward," I told Miss Renfield, but at first she didn't make any attempt to get moving. So I pulled out my pistol and pointed it at the receptionist. "Enough," I said forcefully. "Would you do me a kindness and unlock the front door, of course with reasonable haste? I would be very much obliged. I would rather not have to resort to using violence." Miss Renfield finally took her big keychain and came out from behind the counter. "With haste," I demanded, and walked ahead to the iron gate. By turning my back on Miss Renfield, I made a fatal mistake. The next moment, a heavy object hit me on the back of my head, and I fell to the ground. The last thing I remember is Miss Renfield's face, which bent over me and said, "We're going to have to do a second leucotomy today." Then her keychain hit me in the face, and I lost consciousness. When I regained consciousness, I was in a dark room. It took some time for my eyes to get used to the low light that the door slit allowed. The room was small and windowless, and I realized it was one of the cells of the clinic. I was lying in a bed, the only piece of furniture available, and I had a severe headache. Then I noticed that I had been given a head bandage. Had my brain already been cut? Have I been trapped in my body without any chance of getting in touch with the outside world? I tried to move my limbs, but I couldn't. Had my spinal cord been severed? According to the felonious staff of this institution, I would not be surprised at all. I was close to despair when the door was unlocked and a man in a white doctor's coat stepped in. When enough light shone through the opening, I recognized Dr. Seward. He came to my bed and said to me, "Ah, Dr. Watson, you're awake. How do you feel?" "How do I feel?" I repeated. "What did you do to me? Have you filleted my brain?" Dr. Seward smiled. "No, nothing of the sort," he said. "You are planning to," I cried. "I warn you, don't dare put your hands on me. I will fight back with all available forces." Dr. Seward had a short laugh. "My dear colleague," he said, "you are a very renegade patient. We are not going to have to sedate you." "Don't you dare," I replied. "You are not going to get away with it anyway. Scotland Yard has already been informed. The officers must already be here and should arrive at any moment. They will put a stop to your game and hold you accountable." With this empty threat, I had played my last trump card. No one would come to save me. There was no doubt that I would not survive the next hour. So that would be the end of it, under the scalpel of a crazy psychiatrist. The last thing I could ask for was certainty about Holmes's fate. "Tell me at least," I asked Dr. Seward, "what you did with Mr. Holmes. Did you murder him? Admit it." Then I heard a familiar voice saying, "Just rest, my dear Watson." Holmes stepped through the cell door, alive and unharmed. "Holmes," I cried, equally surprised and relieved, "you're doing well." "The news of my death is very exaggerated," he remarked laconically as he got closer to my bed. "Be that as it may, Holmes," I replied, "look out. Dr. Seward is a dangerous criminal, a butcher." To my astonishment, Holmes and Dr. Seward began to laugh at the same time. "My good Watson," Holmes said then, "I owe you a number of explanations. First of all, I would like to assure you that Dr. Seward was just kind enough to help me with this whole charade, and he has probably played his role very convincingly. Nevertheless, I can guarantee you that he will not pose any danger." "A charade?" I asked. "Indeed," Holmes said. "There has been a suspicion for some time that something was amiss in this clinic. Patients died unexpectedly and without any medically comprehensible reason. Dr. Seward faced a mystery. But then he had a suspicion. Most of the time, the patients who died were wealthy. Right after, their possessions would disappear. Therefore, one had to assume that someone here is murdering patients in order to enrich themselves." "Miss Renfield!" I cried immediately. "Remarkable," Holmes said. "Even though you got 2 neat blows to the head, which were excellently cared for and bandaged by Dr. Seward, by the way, you are still halfway good about your combination. Quite right, my dear Watson. Miss Renfield was under suspicion from the very beginning, and I had myself brought here under the disguise of a patient to gather evidence. I understand that I succeeded in a very short time. The lady is already in custody." I began to understand the full scope of Holmes's so-called charade. "That means," I said slowly, "that everything was just bogus? I understand. So you were never crazy and therefore didn't bite a policeman?" Holmes looked at me in amazement. "What are you thinking?" he said. "Of course I bit the policeman. The whole thing had to be credible." "Poor Mrs. Hudson," I asked, "was not initiated?" Holmes shook his head. "And Inspector Lestrade?" I continued. "Too unreliable," Holmes said. "Lestrade knew nothing, but he's used to that." "And of course your brother didn't know anything? That nefarious guy?" I suspected. No, no, Holmes replied. Of course. Without Mycroft, the spectacle would never have succeeded. To be precise, it was he who pulled the necessary strings in the background. Oh, dear Lord, I sighed. Then I will have to apologize to Mycroft. Why? Asked Holmes. I hesitated for a moment and then confessed. Well, I knocked him down. You beat Mycroft? Holmes repeated, astonished. Why is that? Because of you, I replied. Holmes pondered briefly, only to find, Oh, that certainly won't hurt Mycroft. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. Still, Watson, you should not only apologize to him, but also thank him. It was he who followed you from the Diogenes Club, watched you being overwhelmed by Miss Renfield, and then intervened by calling the police. Mycroft saved you. Only then did Dr. Seward and I come in, bring you here, and take care of you first. I understand, I said, noticing that I was tied to the bed frame with leather straps. And why the shackles? Oh, sorry, Dr. Seward said, immediately trying to loosen the straps quickly. The power of habit. I rubbed my freed wrists and looked at Holmes with a serious face. Well, I began, I have to congratulate you on your charade. It was indisputable, opaque, and frightening. It drove me to the extreme and put me in danger of death. And this leads me to my central question, dear friend. When would you have thought about initiating me? Sorry, Watson, Holmes said, unmoved. But it is like I said, the whole staging had to be credible. But I was alone with you in your cell, I cried indignantly. Wouldn't you have been able to give me a little hint instead of just sizzling stupid stuff? Holmes looked at me in amazement. But I did, he replied. Did you not understand the hint? Then I probably overestimated your abilities. I closed my eyes and focused on not hitting the roof. My dear Holmes, I began somewhat sneeredly, do me a favour and remain silent. And Dr. Seward, would you be kind enough to sign my dismissal papers? I want to go home. A week later, Holmes and I sat at the breakfast table on Baker Street and studied the morning newspaper. Mrs. Hudson had just brought it up wordlessly, because she had vowed never to speak to Holmes again, a vow that would last only a few days, as I anticipated. Not only did Mrs. Hudson blame Holmes for his deception, which had caused her so much concern, but I, for myself, was not quite sure whether Holmes had not crossed a line with this whole charade. However, looking at the newspaper taught me something different. Miss Renfield had apparently confessed and was charged with 7 counts of murder. Who else, if not Holmes, could have stopped the Sister of Death? That's just such a thing in mental health hospitals, I said. You can never be sure who the inmates are and who belongs to the staff. Spare me with your platitudes, Holmes replied. The men in the white coats are the doctors, those without coats are the fools. I put the newspaper aside and smiled. And this is the only thing that distinguishes the two groups? My dear Watson, Holmes replied, don't twist my words. It would be desirable if in the world outside of psychiatry the assignment could be just as easy. I had to laugh. You know, Holmes, I explained amusedly, for my part I have a doctor's coat. What about you? Did you bring the coat from Vienna? Asked Holmes sharply. Very funny, Holmes, I said. Do you really know what I've been through because of you? I thought you were mad. I thought you would spend the rest of your life in a cell. I thought Dr. Seward would kill you. My dear Watson, Holmes declared, unmoved and with his index finger raised. That's the difference between the two of us. You, as admirable as that may be, are limited to thinking. I, on the other hand, focus on knowing. That's why I solved the case while you let yourself be recklessly crushed by the murderer. Did you know, Holmes, I replied, irritated, that according to my professional medical diagnosis, you are crazy? I will request your return to Bethlehem as soon as possible.